Welcome to Turn the Page, the official podcast of the Syosset Public Library.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Turn the Page, the official podcast of the Syosset Public Library. I am here with an amazing author, and I'm going to let her introduce herself. Here we go.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Nathalie, for having me again. I'm Laura, L.M. Elliot. You all will forgive me. I'm getting over COVID, so I have quite a voice. It isn't really quite my own, but I'm so excited to talk to you all today. So I'm very grateful for this invitation to talk about Bee and the New Deal horse, which is very dear to my heart. I am a historical and biographical fiction writer. I was a reporter, magazine reporter in Washington, D.C. for 20 years before I turned to writing historical fiction. And I've been here now for 20 years and written this. I'm working on my 14th historical novel. I feel like was very blessed to be a reporter first before turning to fiction, because I think that's really affected how I write and how I research. Facts and research tell me what to write. Those facts and research tell me what the parable is in real life that I'm trying to find to capture for my readers. I used to write really long narratives unfortunately we don't get to do this much as journalists anymore, but 8,000 to 10,000 words, where I would follow a subject around for a month or even two to write in scenes the experiences of their lives. And that really taught me to find, when I was trying to illustrate an issue, or in historical fiction, of course, a time period, to find a human being who was affected by those issues and those events, and how they draw up courage and resolve and compassion to get through that time period, really putting a beating heart on history. As a reporter too, you're always like listening and watching and absorbing if you're a good reporter. And because if you're really doing all those things, life will drop these amazing stories right in front of you. So with Bee, for instance, I really very much was reporting and pulling in a lot of different a lot of different real life personas that I either read about or I knew about, or I was watching training horses. And it also teaches me to make kind of a large cast of characters, with the characters being emblematic of the types of people who are going through those travails. So I feel like I've been really, really lucky to do all the different kind of writing I've done. And in my fiction writing, I've jumped continents and centuries. Not most historical fiction writers are smart enough to stay in one time period and one particular time frame and type of story. But I've really enjoyed jumping all around and learning everything from. I've written about the young poetess who was the Leonardo da Vinci's first portrait in the 15th century, to Revolutionary War, Peggy Schuyler, the youngest Schuyler sister, to World War II, to right now I'm working on Watergate. So that's me.
Wonderful. So for those of you who don't know, this is Laura's second time back here. So the first time she was back here, we were talking about her book, beautiful book, Louisa, June, and the Nazi and the Waves. And for those of you who have not read it, please go and read it. It's phenomenal. It really is. Yes. I'm not just saying that. And so we're back again to talk about her new book. And it just came out actually March 28th.
Yes, just recent. It's brand new baby.
Yeah. It's called Bee and the New Deal horse. So it's out now. We have it in our library collection, so come and check it out. So I just want to ask you, first and foremost, what inspired you to write such a beautiful novel? It's just so beautiful and lyrical and rich with history.
You are so kind. I would love to just sit down and talk to you all the time. Thank you very, very much, because Louisa June and B are both, I don't know, they really came from a lot of personal thought and exposure to people. And so they're very dear to my heart, those narratives in particular. So it's really gratifying to hear your response. Thank you. As I was saying, I was a reporter for so long. I very much think about finding holes in coverage. And one of the things about the Great Depression is there are marvelous books out there, but they tend to be about the Dust Bowl or they're set in big cities, or they're about bootleggers. Few are really kind of set in the East Coast and in a mostly middle class family. Americans who are also, horrendously upended and undone by the stock market crash. As Bee will say of her one-time banker father, ever since the Great Depression fell on us like a plague and his bank closed, Daddy's tried to make do with odd jobs. But a man who'd spent his adult life in three-piece suits and bow ties overseeing bank accounts for Richmond's old society didn't exactly transition into being a handyman or a tobacco picker. So, and also from the statistic too, in 1932, which was the worst year of the Depression, 28% of Americans were out of work and didn't even have odd jobs to do. So they had no income coming in whatsoever, which is just stunning. My father was a Depression era kid. He grew up on a chicken farm outside Richmond. And he had a really, hard scramble, hand-to-mouth life as a child. And yet he would always talk about how his cousins, his aunts, and his uncles who lived in the city of Richmond and struggled to put food on the table because they all lost their white-collar jobs in Richmond, would come to Daddy's every Sunday for their one good meal of the week, with his parents sharing, what little food they had from crops that they were growing or the eggs that their hens were hatching. They shared it. And even as a child, I was kind of struck by that matter-of-fact sense of responsibility to share, and that kind of, there but for the grace of God go I attitude that was really pervasive during the Depression. And the sense of kind of stoic, we're going to get through this, ingenuity, the things they made do with are kind of amazing. And this no nonsense, but of course I'm going to help you attitude that they somehow managed to hold on to during a really terrifying time. I grew up, I had a very lucky kind of rarefied experience these days in that I was a late in life baby for my parents. And I grew up on what had been my grandfather's dairy farm. He was a gentleman farmer in that he was a lawyer, but he also had a dairy farm. Fairfax County was actually the biggest dairy producer in the United States at that time. Anyway, he had to accept payment during the Depression in, game or rabbits or fish that his clients caught, or one time even a piano. So, which made it difficult for him to make his own bills too. And yet he managed to maintain this small backyard barn of horses for his family, who absolutely adored riding. So being the New Deal horse is sort of a combination of, my own family's, the influences of my family's experiences with this very hard national crisis that happened to people. I did have the horse part. I know we're going to talk about this, but I'll go ahead and say the horse part is I did have a pony named Stormy when I was little, named for Marguerite Henry's, Misty of Chincoteague, right? But I really witnessed and experienced the symbiosis, this kind of poetic communion that's possible between this enormous beast, amazing animal, horse, and a good and trained rider by watching my daughter and her USEA and USPC compatriots train their jumpers and eventers. Those girls they just have incredible sense of camaraderie and grit and determination and just this absolute love for their horses. So, and I was so grateful to their sometimes a little bit fierce, no nonsense, gruff, but entirely devoted to them horse trainers, the women, who train them, which you can see the beginnings of Mrs. Scott in what I'm saying to you there. And the book really kind of allowed me to make this vow of affection and respect for these kind of extraordinary women who are in this horse world the way that they are. So, and that too, is that the thing, if you all want to, if you listeners out there want to be writers, when I say keep your ears open, keep your antenna up at all times, because for decades, I didn't realize that I was saving string for this story, right? It wrote, once I did my initial research, it wrote very quickly for me, because I've watched these women and just been in such awe of them, young and old. So
here's my question. Compared to Louisa June and Nazi in the Waves and Bee on the New Deal Horse, was this book more challenging to write because it did hit closer to home, or like less challenging to write? Like, how would you compare the two in the writing process?
you ask such good questions.
I just thought of that. I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, they're good questions. I honestly would say that they're kind of comparable in some ways. When we talked about Louisa June, if people want to listen to our conversation on that, I mentioned that Daddy did grow up in that Tidewater area. So my aunts, my uncles, my cousins, I was down in that area a lot. And so that kind of musical pictorial way of speaking was familiar to me, was kind of, cut my teeth on that kind of way of talking, which was a glorious gift. I did, as a reporter, wrote, one of my main beats was writing about mental health issues, which, as you know, Louisa June deals with. So that was familiar territory for me too. So it wasn't hard, but it's difficult material, right? With B, yeah, no, I guess the thing that's hard is that when you're writing about people, a type of person and people that and you really admire, you want to do right by them. Yes. So there is kind of a little hovering thing there about, are you getting that right? Are you presenting them the way you really want to? So there's that kind of quirk involved in that.
Got it. Very cool. So that's going to lead into, I want to talk about the characters a little, but like without saying too much about them. So let's talk about Bee and Louisa for that matter. So like Louisa June, Bee is resilient and strong, and unexpectedly had to take on roles that she didn't necessarily ask for. It's the circumstances that were unfortunately given to her. So my question is, do you find inspiration from the other characters that you've written? Is Bia and the other characters based off of anyone in particular, which is your family? Yes. You kind of answered it, but what inspired you to create strong, loving, and inspirational female characters? And they are, which is amazing. Like, this book is full of just inspirational female strength, and I love it. And like, can you talk about that more?
Yeah. Oh, I'm so glad to hear that. Yeah, because these are strong women that can be fairly intimidating sometimes, right? And the wonderful job I had was to show that there's really an enormous, not hidden, but cloaked sometimes, compassion and sense of humanity, and the wanting to help other people in both Bee and Mrs. Scott, right? So it was interesting because I knew you were going to ask about the two of them. I was thinking carefully about the difference between Louisa June and Bee, and the thing about Louisa June, both of them are hit with this just cataclysmic, sudden, earth pulled out from underneath their feet kind of thing that sadly world events can sometimes do to us. And certainly World War II and those, Nazi U-boats off the East Coast and the Great Depression were very much that. With Louisa June, she has that, that she has an underlying issue of trying to buoy up her mother, who has, quote unquote, the melancholy, as well as then having to deal with that horrific grief that a parent and all, family members, but felt about the loss of the brother. With Bee, she's trying to deal with this just sudden upending of all safety in her life. The stock market crashes, her father loses his job, then they lose their house and they lose all their belongings. Mama gets sick and dies, which again is something that I found because of research. That it's totally plausible. One of the things we don't think about when there's economic fallout is that when citizens can't pay their taxes, local jurisdictions have to lay off teachers, stop running school buses, turn off street lamps. And in Richmond at that time, they sprayed for mosquitoes in the marshlands and the wetlands of the James River, and they couldn't do that anymore. And there was this horrific uptick of malaria, which killed off lots of people. And that's what I have happened to Mama. I didn't just pluck it out of, I thought, oh my God, that would have happened to her too. So with being one of the challenges she has to deal with, besides the fact, and I guess we should say right at the beginning, is that it opens with, and I'll talk about it more a little bit later, I think, on a different question, but the father leaves her and her little sister Vivian in a hayloft. He's taking them to a specific farm of a long ago acquaintance and left them in that hayloft in the night and disappears, leaving only a note behind that he hopes that the lady of the house, is Mrs. Scott, will take care of them. But B doesn't know Mrs. Scott. Mrs. Scott doesn't know B. And so, she is faced with this, oh my God, what do I do now? And how do I feed? And he does it. A lot of parents did that. I should skip ahead. There's a term called farm out I tend to think, I'd always thought of, well, it means that I'm giving a job to somebody who knows how to do it better than I do. But it comes from the Depression. It comes from parents who were in such terrible economic situations, desperate to feed their children, would take them to farms of relatives or friends and leave them there for a while to be fed. That was farming out. So that's what happens to be. So one of the things that she has to try to deal with in terms of, spiritually, and in her personality, is something she worries about with Vivian. She says Vivian, who's, young and a sprite, and she wants to really kind of try to protect Vivian's innocence, as well as figure out a way to feed her, before she's able to figure out a way to ingratiate them in Mrs. Scott's life. And I should say right now, Mrs. Scott's farm is in terrible straits. There's a horrific drought that we'll talk more about, because it was factual. And she's probably going to have to sell off all her horses. I mean, she's struggling economically too. And here are these two beautiful, but, stray children, right? But she will say about Vivian, I might have feared that my baby sister was already long gone bitter before even reaching a decade of life. Hunger and constant unknowns can do that to a child. And so, that's what, B is trying to overcome from the very beginning. And she, like Louisa June, she is brave and she's stubborn and she's ingenious and she's fiercely protective of her little sister, right? Yeah. And honestly, because you asked me that, I was thinking, because sometimes there are unconscious influences on a choice like that. Part of it was what I read about Depression era kids and what I saw in their faces in the photographs that, beautiful photographs had been taken of that time period, and just how they're kind of clinging to one another and working and together. There's just kind of this amazing sibling bond going on. And honestly, I was thinking about it. My daughter is this phenomenal and protective big sister. And they're grown-ups now. I mean, my daughter's in her 30s and my son's almost 30. But she was always very protective of him, called him from the time he was bitty, Peter, honey, do you need something? And he thought that she just shot the moon all the time. He just thought that she was so extraordinary. And I remember there was this one time that she got stung by a bee upstairs in my house. And through her tears, she turned and said, "It's okay, Mom, because it didn't sting Peter, and he's not young enough and he's not old enough to understand it." You're going to have, out of the mouth of babes come these amazing statements, right? So I think I was also influenced by that. And they would tell each other stories, that story that she tells about fireflies and how the firefly comes, that kind of, little myth that she creates to try to get Vivian to go to sleep. I think that was influenced by watching my kids and my daughter tell them so many stories. And recently, my daughter broke her elbow really badly, and my son insisted on flying home from Los Angeles to help take care of her. They're still that close. So I think because you asked this question, I want to thank you for that, because I'm now going to sit down with them and say, hey, by the way, so, this is kind of, I always try to avoid saying that writing is magic, because it's craft. I don't want anybody to think that it's this nebulous thing that they can't do. It's just, there are some times, and I've been doing it long enough now too, that, I've been writing for 40 years now. Yikes. But I have been. So some of it becomes instinctive for me, once I've got my notes and my research. So.
It's beautiful. Who was the most challenging character to develop, and who is your favorite character to develop?
Again, this is a really good question, and I'll start with the first one. And I've got some notes here just because I want to make sure that I stick to this one particular character who I loved. One of the hard things about writing good historical fiction, when you're writing about certain geographic regions and certain time periods, is to be able to create plausible, authentic, truly integrated communities, right? And therefore, Black characters of color who have agency. There's the kind of tragic thing in terms of having to find is that agency, right? It's just the fact of our history, tragically. So with Malachi, who I think is kind of an amazing character and a quiet hero throughout, I figured out his backstory in facts and historical events. One of them was doing general reading about Virginia in 1932. I learned about the Bonus Army, which is only mentioned briefly in the novel, but there's more in my afterword, and there's certainly more on my website if you guys are interested in learning more about it. My website's lmelliot.com. I'm embarrassed to say that I didn't know about the Bonus Army, which I should have. It was thousands in 1932, thousands of World War I veterans, white and Black, together from across the nation, marching to Washington, D.C. to lobby Congress for a bonus, this kind of compensation for lost wages, in essence, from their service during World War I. They weren't due to get it until 1945. But, given the Depression and how, so many people were in such horrible trouble, the veterans wanted their money then in 1932. So they were incredibly patriotic and hopeful. They banded together. Like I said, a lot of them marching from way across the country, and they kept vigil on Capitol Hill as Congress deliberated about the bonus bill and whether they could give them the money then. And a lot of them brought their children and families with them, but their children specifically to witness history and the beauty of Congress. They camped in Anacostia and created this really impressive organized tent city, which was divided into streets named for different states. The Salvation Army even ran a library in the middle of it. And each night the veterans and their families gathered together to be for music or poetry readings. They sang gospel, blues, country, popular, Blacks and whites together, listening and performing together. And visitors were just astonished by the two races mixing, and working together so happily, sharing their billets and their chores and their rations. Again, tragically, local authorities, remember this is in 1932, horrifically, these kinds of things happen. Then local authorities and the regular army saw the veterans' growing numbers and, cooperative work and their integration as threatening, as subversive, as potentially socialist, as even Bolshevik. The House passes the bill, but the Senate votes it down. And when they voted down, President Hoover sent troops to drive the Bonus Army out. Even though the veterans had already dispersed, they left singing God, America the Beautiful as they left. Still, hard hit and so disappointed, but still singing that, heading back to their camp for the most part in Anacostia. But the cavalry ran the veterans down. The soldiers charged them with bayonets and lobbed tear gas at them. And this was all under the orders of the army and young officers Eisenhower, MacArthur, Patton. The army then went to Anacostia and it burned down the camp and it burned down all the veterans' belongings
Wow.
because they saw it as a threat, this kind of socialist threat. And for many people, that was just the last straw in terms of the Hoover administration's just kind of callous disregard for the plight of the average American, or just not working to do anything for them. And a lot of them is credited with that turning so many of them to FDR, who was this relatively unknown progressive. Reading about the bonus army, because it did actually factually march through the town of Middleburg, which, as you know, is Mrs. Scott's old town. Malachi could witness them going. And so that gave me, that made me then, all right, I'm going to make him a World War I veteran. He's representative of these many brave African Americans who fought in Europe in segregated units. We didn't include them, but the French did in some battles. They fought actually in the Argonne Offensive, and France awarded 175 of them the Croix de Guerre. Now, when these Black veterans returned to the United States, they were expecting their courage under fire and their service to the nation to grant them more equality back home. But tragically, again, this is just not the case. They're met with this horrific backlash of racism and white resentment. And it was friction that boiled up into, honestly, one of the most violent periods in American history, called the Red Summer of 1919. And there were race riots that rocked 26 cities across the United States, including DC. Some of the Black veterans were attacked when their communities were holding parades to celebrate what they had done, which is what I make Malachi's backstory. So those were all things that he has, that impaired vision. So those were all, I wanted those facts to create him. And of course, his relationship, I think, is really, like I said, he's kind of a quiet hero, both for Mrs. Scott and then with Vivian, and with Dr. LeBurn, who was based on a doctor that I read about, a Black doctor in Loudoun County, who was very, very important to the community, and yet denied the right to admit his patients to Loudoun County Hospital because of the color of his skin, tragically. That man he was Maurice Breton King Edmund, I guess, was the real doctor. If you're interested in these things and the Black Americans who served in World War I, there's a really wonderful website on the library. Thank you, librarians. The Library of Virginia has something called, it's a digital collection where you can actually drop in and see profiles and photographs of these veterans. So that was Malachi. I think he became a really important part to the story. Mrs. Scott, maybe, I don't, when you ask me my favorite, I loved all of them, but Mrs. Scott, again, kind of gave me this chance to celebrate these, unique women who, they're fierce and strong and amazing. There's a great essay collection called Horse Girls. If you're interested, or your listeners are interested, describes the bunch of different essays. But at one point they describe horse trainers as, quote, strong, independent businesswomen who demonstrate affection by raising jumps and taking away your stirrups, which really hurts if you're a rider. It's like the worst kind of workout. Unsentimental about horses, but devoted to them for life, which is very much Mrs. Scott, right? She is this astute, self-possessed 60-something woman who becomes solely responsible for her horses that she trains in these farmlands that had been in her family for generations. So she has that, that added responsibility and weight of having to try to live up to tradition and dead relatives. So there's tragedy in her past too, which we have to come to understand and be revealed. Like B, she has to kind of go on her own personal journey of trying to open herself back up again, to open her soul and her heart to others. She's hurt, and she has to also recognize that she can't put the jump into someone if it isn't already there, which is one of the biggest lessons she has to come to learn. She's terse, she's intimidating, and yet she's the most unwavering champion you could possibly have, right? And I so enjoyed writing her and adding comments like, she has kind of droll sense of humor in that terseness, right? I love putting in things like, I hate having to be charming when she has to get dressed up to go, to the fancy formal party to chat up potential clients, people who she regards as fools. But she has to do it to get, to get their business, the training going. So she's an amalgamation of people that I was blessed to know and witness growing up, but also some women that I read about that you can read about more in my afterword, who were so much fun to learn about. One of them, for instance, being a widow who was running a 70 stall barn, which it's just enormous. And she had, a minimal staff because it was a depression. And among the guys was still known in these local memoirs as like the eye for horses. If you really wanted to get your horse looked at, you took it to her. Dorothy Lee. So she was just, I really enjoyed writing her.
So what does the research process entail? Because this book is so rich in history. Where do we begin?
Thank you. It's the breadcrumbs. And if you're really lucky, you find librarians like you who will help. I am completely indebted to librarians always. So you guys are the keeper of truth. And in this particular instance, this one thing I'm going to tell you about was like, I would not have gotten it without these librarians in this historical collection in Leesburg. One of the things that I again, as this lifelong Virginian. Oh, and also as I'm talking about this, there's a relationship to your area here and what I'm about to tell you. Okay. I'm embarrassed to say, even being this long time, lifelong Virginian, that I didn't know about this 1930 drought that took Virginia to its knees. Literally, it dried up, it dried up creeks, it dried up wells, hayfields and grazing pastures were just decimated and scorched. Corn came up only about knee high and then would tassel and then died because there just wasn't any water at all. And I think I mentioned before, Fairfax County, which is part of that area, the biggest dairy producer in the country, and they lost all their cows that either dropped dead in the field or they had to be slaughtered because there was just no water for them. So, I mean, it was just laid waste. I learned about it accidentally, and I'm sorry you all can't see this. I should have pulled it out to show you, Nathalie. But I learned about this 1930 drought kind of accidentally in one of those surprising, completely story-defining insights that research yields, which is what the great fun of research is. I noticed a teeny caption on a map of the Great Hunts of Virginia that ran in a November 1930 Fortune magazine. I'll pull it out to show you the magazine itself. I'm sorry you guys can't see it, but it's this beautiful thing, right? Anyway, I found it because I was reading about like the hunt. I was just reading about the area to try to learn about the horse world and the hunt country. And I got this because there's this article that was running about the transplanting of Long Island's hunt set to Loudoun and Fauquier County in Virginia in the 1920s. I picked up the article because I'd always thought that the hunt world out there was this kind of, this long-standing old Virginia gentry thing, but but mostly it was this influx of Long Islanders coming down. Which we can talk about more in a little bit, but they heard about these lovely rolling hills and the grass that was so green and these amazing horses. So they had run off a lot of the fox on Long Island. So they decided to move down, these business tycoons and people who had a lot of money who could move down. So a lot of millionaires from Long Island. Anyway, in 1930, in this, I wish we could show people this, but you can see this beautiful map that's
Oh,
here.
wow.
There's this little caption, and I've circled it in red. That says, "So serious was the 1930 drought that Orange County fox hunters, Orange County, New York, okay, not Virginia, Orange County fox hunters, last month, I'm sorry, I can't read this. Last month commissioned Dr. G.A.I.M. Sykes, professional rainmaker, suggested price $12,000.
Yeah.
Back then, it's like the equivalent of $200,000. And when I read the article, it's because they were frustrated. The ground was so hard and dry that the hounds couldn't catch the scent of the fox. So I wanted to know about this Dr. G.A.I.M. Sykes, right? And you know the chapter I'm referring to, right, with Dr. Chapman. All that stuff came from these amazing librarians. I couldn't find anything, and I'm a pretty good researcher. I went into the Library of Congress and all. They found for me clips, old clips of local newspapers, and then following that trail, we're able to find some academic articles, more journal in JSTOR articles that talked about his fake pseudoscientific vocabulary, which having read, and this wild personality that he had. So it handed me, so first off, that's how I learned about this drought, that it just like decimated and laid waste to everybody, including Mrs. Scott. So she's in a really difficult position financially. Well, I mean, as you know, she's horrifically in debt, and yet she's going to take these girls on. That chapter allowed me, so first I got this whole kind of important pivotal moment out of that little caption, which I didn't know about the drought. It's phenomenal. That's what research and what librarians can do, you all. So, but it also allowed me to write, kind of this wild character and this one wild scene, which was completely out of fact, you all. I didn't really make it up. I just pulled the elements from what I was reading. And it also allows you to see that even though she has kind of this flinty personality, that Mrs. Scott is all about protecting people, horses, people, her neighbors. Yeah. So that's my research.
Wow. Yeah, I read that, and I couldn't. I think you have a caption, like a little excerpt in the back about it.
I did.
And I couldn't believe that it was true that people were desperate. It was sad.
Well,
Really.
it was. That's the other thing
Yeah.
that it did, is it also allowed me those two things. And allowed me, it's so over the top that it's comic. And yet, as you just said, it allowed me to really show rather than tell just how desperate times were, because of how life and death water was at that time. We've got bottled water, we have reservoirs. We don't think about, if the creek dries up and your well dries up, you have no water until the next rain. We don't really understand that kind of like immediate threat anymore. So it was important that I do that. Yeah. So
Very interesting. Like I said, I've learned so much from reading your book. So I just want to touch upon the title, Bee and the New Deal Horse.
yeah.
So how did you decide on this title?
Honestly, at first I kind of started out with the Black Tuesday horse, because that's when the stock market crashed, kind of having this, sense of crisis and catastrophe with this horse. It's beautiful and incredibly talented, but as you know, is volatile and dangerous. And he too has to kind of come to learn to trust her again, trust people and trust Bee again. So, the question in the book, when Mrs. Scott figures out that Bee's there because she saves a horse from colic, because she knows how to do that. The question becomes, can Bee kind of convince this formidable, woman who's a total stranger to take them in? And there's this really kind of long, anxiety-filled campaign to win over Mrs. Scott, and maybe win over a place in her heart ultimately. But they will agree that she is going to try to ride, that Mrs. Scott will try to train Bee to safely ride this horse, and potentially maybe ride in horse shows both to further her reputation among the community as like this incredible horse trainer, maybe potentially win a little bit of prize money that can help them. And in doing so, this bonding together, find a new deal and new hope for themselves. You know, they end up lifting one another up. I pulled another quote from Ralph, who's another one of my favorite characters, who's minor, but he's, you know, this ancient stable hand, right? And you learn in the end, I don't want to give too much away, but you learn that he's been there throughout Miss Millie's entire life. You know, he's worked at that barn, and he's the type that I know well too, is like that he's the man who will save a horse from anything and has more sense, and, you know, a country philosopher, right? He says she rides a really kind of harrowing ride at the end, Mrs. Scott does. And as he says, tips her hat in total sass to this guy who had abused the chestnut. Again, I'm trying to be careful not to give too much away. But Ralph turns to B and says, ho ho, look at that. That girl always was nervy. Ralph chuckled, wiped his eyes, and blew his big old nose in a handkerchief. Then, with reverence and relief and unmistakable love in his voice, he said, see that ride? That's because of you, Beatrice. You opened up her heart again. And trust me, young'un, it's a lion's heart. So it's a new deal, right? So not, and also reflecting, I know you were going to ask about the quotes that I include from Black Beauty at the beginning. I'll just leap right to that from Black Beauty. And then FDR, who talks about, you know, hope, and that we must proceed through this horrible time with compassion for one another, that we are, you know, all in this together. I really, it occurred to me as I was writing it. And again, the Black Tuesday horse is kind of a fairly esoteric reference. Not everybody would get that that's the Depression. You know, one of the tricks about titles is you want to be able to refer to the time period without being on the nose and stating it exactly, you know, like be in the Depression. So sorry, forgive my voice. As I was writing and as it was coming, and, you know, sometimes these things evolve of how much you can see Mrs. Scott lifting because of Beatrice. The New Deal suddenly went, well, that makes sense. Of course that makes sense. And those two quotes, the one from what you're referring to is the one from Black Beauty, which of course is every person should read, horse lover or not, because it's magnificent. There's a narrator, a horse, saying, I don't think Ginger, does find pleasure in biting, said Mary Legs, who's a little pony. It is just a bad habit. She says no one was ever kind to her, so why should she not bite? Right? So that's the, I'm hoping that the two things combined really, there's the parable of the benefit of compassion.
Beautiful. Oh, I love that. Do we have time for one more question?
We do, of course. Yeah, don't worry
Okay.
about
it. Do you want to talk about any potential projects that you have coming up in the future?
I do. And you know, one thing you were going to ask me, and I will go ahead and read this one thing. I know you were going to ask me about themes. I'm working on something that's not really related. I am wonderfully lucky in how varied my work can be. I've done, you know, older YA to new adult to being Louisa June being more kind of the middle grade, you know, older middle grade, younger YA, and picture books. I have some of those too. So right now I'm working on there. I'm going to have 3 books that are more kind of docudrama political books. One is about McCarthyism. I have a book about the Berlin Wall going up in 1961, literally overnight. And then I'm working right now on Watergate in 1973, which had lots of, it wasn't just Watergate things that were going on. The ERA, for instance, was trying to go through passage at that time. Kind of in the Vietnam War ended. It was quite a year. So That's what I'm working on right now, kind of desperately. I'm late. I'm late with it. So
I can't wait to read those when they come out.
thank you. Yeah, it was fascinating thing. And I hope very, I hope it, it's very much an overlay of feminism, which I sure you can tell I have, one of the things that I hope that you take away from this is to really like and respect strong, opinionated women.
Absolutely.
All these women can pass the Bechtel test for sure. And there's also one of the other things about the horse world that's really kind of beautiful. And I really saw among my daughter and her compatriots is this kind of sisterhood among them. They are, they aren't, I mean, they're so supportive of one another, and no nonsense, no silliness, no cattiness, no clicks, nothing. They work to get, you can't be that way on a horse, a 1,600-pound animal. And they're kind of just an extraordinary sense of camaraderie and communion among them. That's a beautiful thing to witness. So there's that, this respect for strong women, and also kind of a window into this, what for many people is a rarefied world of horse riding. I mean, to be really good at questioning at the level that Bee wants to become, and that Mrs. Scott rides at, and that my daughter and her friends were riding at. It takes a lot of work. It's not like you get on a horse and he just does it. It takes a lot of work and a lot of coming to trust one another, and training, and hours and hours and hours. As you'll learn as you read Bee, I hope, in exciting sequences. But it's really, it is this kind of magical symbiosis that is hard won through very dedicated and careful kind of work. Because for one thing, you don't want to hurt the horse, and you don't want to get hurt yourself, which is very easy to do when you're taking these massive jumps, for instance. So I think the partnership between Bee and the horse really kind of becomes a metaphor for the things that we're talking about, in terms of listening with respect and compassion to others, especially for kind of hidden tragedies or traumas that may have occurred that you don't know about yet, that are affecting that person's perhaps being shy or reticent or very wary, as Beatrice is, right? That with the right bit of kindness and the right bit of just respecting of that feeling can open somebody back up again and help them heal. So I don't want to take up too much of your time. I had a passage I could read, but it'll take me a minute, that kind of illustrates how the horse and she connect. You tell me how fast you need to go. I should probably go.
You tell me. I love listening to you.
Okay, all right. I'll read one little thing. The as you know, Bee is wrestling with all these hurts and this distrust stemming from all these cataclysmic events that have befallen on her in her very short 13 years. And because of those things, Bee can kind of instinctively empathize with the horse's dangerous and kind of angry attitude. I don't know if you all have read Seabiscuit or watched the movie too. I mean, this is kind of portrayed very well in that extraordinary nonfiction book that Laura Hildebrand wrote. Anyway, I don't want to tell too much. She saves him from colic, and then there's some other really bad mishaps that occur. So, she describes herself at one point as this kind of the beaten up horse and the beaten down girl. Can they, join together to find a partnership? So this one scene is the beginnings of that. She's come out of the house in the middle of the night worrying about things. She says, "There was just a hint of sunup, a thin red glow seeping along the earth as I came to the stable. The horses were still asleep, except for the chestnut. He was gazing at his stall's back window, away from the sunrise toward the dark, toward the mountains. If I were a poet, I could explain it better. But there was a what the heck will this darn day want of me apprehension about him, a Bring it, defensiveness. If a horse could have a proverbial chip on his shoulder, his was the size of a barn. Somehow, seeing his angst, his desolation, in a moment all the other horses were sleeping blissfully, just like I had snuck out into the night, twitchy with disappointments and questions, while my sister Mrs. Scott slumbered, made my heart ache. For him, for me, it's as if that horse embodied all the fury and fear and loneliness, the self-doubt and what's coming next anxiety I was feeling that morning. Heck, had felt every second since Daddy disappeared. Hearing me approach, the chestnut swung around, pinned his ears back, and threw his head up and down threateningly, until he realized it was me. He went absolutely still then, pricked his ears forward, and nickered. Stupid tears stung my eyes. He nickered again, drawing me to him. I held out my hands. He sniffed them, tickling my palm with that exploring upper lip horses do in greeting. And then he put his muzzle up against my head and rested there. I didn't move. He didn't either. We stayed like that for a long moment of wonderment for us both.
Your writing is beautiful, Laura. Like I can envision like the words dancing. Like it's so beautiful.
Oh, thank
My
you.
goodness.
Thank you so much. Oh, thank you. That makes my day. Thank you very much.
Sure.
So anyway, there's that moment between them, and then the work begins. And as you know, the work is a lot. So, anyway. But I'm hoping that's a moment I think that encapsulates really kind of what the book's about. So.
It's a beautiful book. It really was. I told you the other day. Well, your writing in general is beautiful. Actually, we just got Bia on the shelf because it had to be processed and everything. But Louisa June, I just recommended it to a patient the other day. I did. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'm going to continue to recommend this book. It's just so beautiful. And I loved reading it. And I loved the characters and the setting, the lessons and the themes. It really is a gorgeous book.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for speaking.
Thank you for having me again. And please just know that you're doing that for me and all writers, and mid-list authors. You're the gift of, if you're handing my words to a reader you think will enjoy them, I can't tell you what an amazing gift that is to me. So thank you. And that is something that librarians like you are so critically important for. So thank you very much.
Thank you. So we are going to turn the page and end this chapter. Jessica will have to edit that. And I want to thank Laura for coming on the podcast again and talking about this book, Bia and the New Deal Horse, which is out now. Do you want to say anything else?
No, just thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And this has been an episode of Turn the Page. See you next time.
It's time to close this chapter of Turn the Page. Join us for the next episode.